Okay, I'm back. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to show you, we took out this dried culture that we made yesterday. And I know that this is still probably more active than you're going to get it when you get these in the mail here from these other companies. And you're going to say, why does mine look like these big flakes? Because I don't smash them down into these little pulverized little bits into a powder. I don't know why they bother doing that. I mean, it makes little sense to me other than it just makes it easier to ship. What the heck? My wife and her coffee. All right. So anyway, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to show you. We got ourselves a 1 quart wide mouth jar. This just makes it easier to just get in there. I mean, if that makes any sense there. And when you first get these cultures, they're going to give you some instructions, blah, blah, blah. They actually make it a little bit more complicated than it has to be. If you looked at the first video I did on the initial feeding, you're going to see generally I use about 100 or just over grams of water, and the same thing with flour. And we can do the same thing with this technique, except we're going to do one thing different where, being in a dried state, this is going to be a little bit slower to proof. So for the first day, I'm only going to feed this once in the first 24 hours. And then we're going to see day 2 is, this probably isn't going to be very active yet. So what we'll do is, instead of dumping some out, we're actually just going to leave it in the jar and just add another feeding right to your jar. And it's not going to be a big deal. Now, it's because it's not going to overproof, and we don't want to take out some of the culture that's still forming here because it's still young. I will say that you can do a half of a feeding, like just over 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. I've never had a problem with this. So I'm just going to do what I do. Now, yeah, I am grabbing this with my hands. I did clean my hands. There's no real measure of this. Any amount of starter is going to work. So we put in there the equivalent of, I don't know, maybe like a teaspoon. Okay. And then we'll just take this and we'll put this back. For the sake of simplicity, I already measured out my water. Just over 100 grams, 110. You want to actually use a little bit more water than flour the first time because you got some dried bits in here. And then the same thing with the flour. I'm just trying to do this with one hand for the sake of simplicity here. Just so my wife didn't have to film this with me. Okay, now, just like before, we're just going to stir this up and put the lid on, tighten it up, and then a quarter turn to the left there, you know, counterclockwise there to loosen it up, and we're just going to leave it out on the counter. This actually is going to do a week-long project here where we're going to take a look at its progress, and let me just stir this. I'll come right back. Okay, we're back. So as you can see, I stirred up that culture using my silicone little spatula, I guess you'd call it there, or whatever. I prefer using these to wood because wood can absorb some of that bacteria and they're a little bit harder to clean. Just makes it easier, especially if you're going to work with multiple cultures later on. And as you can see, it's going to look just like the other cultures. You're not really going to be able to see those dried bits, but we're going to be able to take a look at the level. It's showing right around that level of 8 ounces like it did before. And this is probably not even going to like rise very much, but what we can do is, one indicator is we're going to open up the jar tomorrow in about 24 hours and we'll give it a smell. We should be able to smell a little bit of a difference to see if some kind of action has taken place, and we'll come back every day and we'll take a look at it. This is day 1, first initial reviving of our culture that's dried. Okay, let's see, just an update. This is about 8:18 p.m. approximately maybe close to 12 hours afterwards. We said on the initial feeding that we were going to wait 24 hours, but what's interesting is we can see the level of activity that we're already getting, which is interesting with the bubbles here, and there's basically some activity forming. Again, generally we just do, like, say, 1 initial feeding for the first 24 hours. And at least we can see that the culture is actually working. It is reviving itself. So we'll come back and we're going to look at this tomorrow morning after about 24 hours. And we'll do an update with that. Okay, we're back. It's about 24 hours since we started this experiment. We added the dry flakes inside our sourdough starter, and this is a pleasant surprise and very, very interesting. what we can see was, I mean, the level of activity that we have here, it's not typical of what you're going to get from reviving your culture after 24 hours. We will usually see something like this maybe 2, if not 3 days later in some of these powdered cultures. It's just because my culture was one very vigorous culture, but it was also pretty fresh because I pretty much preserved this culture the day before. So it was still relatively strong. Typically, some of these cultures could be mailed out and it's going to take a week in itself, and that, you know, I guess could weaken a culture as well as just being in the refrigerator for, you know, who knows, maybe a week, maybe a month, etc., etc. But it just goes to show you this is what we can expect even from a dried culture. You know, we're going to revive it, and something like this that I get in the mail, typically within 1 week I'm able to bake with it. This one, honestly, we're going to take a look at it the next couple of days, but I would not doubt that this bounces back. Within like 3 or 4 days we could probably make a dough. It's just basically an accelerated timetable, but we'll continue to do this experiment. This is 24 hours afterwards. Now, typically, when I don't get this level of fermentation activity, what I do is I just leave everything that's in there and I just do another feeding, and I check it in about 12 hours. And then pretty much we're going to start to see something like this start to form, where I'll take some of the culture out, save part of it as a backup, and then we're going to continue in a regular feeding routine where it's about every 12 hours, and that's usually how it works. So this one in particular, I'll just take part of this culture out since I know that it's already active and it's working, and I'll continue on the regular feedings every 12 hours, and we'll come back and we'll take a look at this later. Okay. Okay, back here we did a feeding. This is 24 hours after the culture, just so we see as a reference point. It's somewhere between the 8 and 10 mark there or whatever, because I didn't take all the culture out, but I wanted to take some of it out because it is active. We don't need all of it in there. We did a feeding, and we're going to compare this later on tonight, and we're going to see. I would not doubt at this point that this culture is probably going to double in size, and we probably won't need a full week to revive this, but we'll come back tonight in about 12 hours and we'll take a look at it. Okay, we're out. Okay, I'm back. This is a day and a half after I initially started this culture. We did it yesterday morning, and we started with the dry flakes. We waited 24 hours from the first feeding, and as you can see, this thing is already quadrupled in size, almost. It's very, very active. Take the top off here, almost to the very top. So this is a much unexpected and faster experiment from a dried culture. You're not going to get results like this typically. Typically it's going to take maybe at least 5 or 6 days before it's going to be in a state that you can bake with this, but this is by far a very healthy and healthy active culture at this point. We're going to just stop this experiment because at this point this is already ready to use and bake with, and then we can just basically leave a couple tablespoons, put it back in the refrigerator, and we're just ready to go. Surprising. Wow. Typically, we're going to expect results like this, like I said, after maybe 5 or 6 days at least. But I guess it was a healthy, active culture, and it was freshly dehydrated, so it wasn't basically sitting very long, and we were able to revive this very quickly within a day and a half with very impressive results. Basically, the feeding routine would be: first day, you let it go a full 24 hours before you have to feed it. If you start to see some bubbles and some action at that point, you could just even leave what's in there and just do a feeding right on top of it. And generally, it's not going to be as active as this was. But if you do start to see some activity and like 50% or more growth, at that point, you could start to take out like maybe a little bit of a backup, you know, just in case you mess up your culture there. Start a second jar, or just throw some out, discard it, and start feeding on a normal feeding routine like you would regularly, about every 12 hours, until we get this thing up to full strength, which is basically like this is very bubbly, light, a lot of action going on here, and then that's it. And then at that point you just start baking with it, like I said, and go back to the normal feeding routine like I did in the first video there. And Giacomo Calabrese, this is reviving your dried sourdough starter culture video finale. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Bye.